Hello guys, it's the Unclear 999. Today's video is about George Washington. George Washington, the figure whose name would come to define a nation, was born on February 22nd, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, into a modest but respected family of landowners. Though not born into great wealth, Washington's early life was shaped by the values of discipline, honor, and responsibility ideals that would carry him through the greatest challenges of his time. His father, Augustine Washington, died when George was only 11 years old, and much of his moral upbringing was left to his strong-willed mother, Mary Bowell Washington. Lacking access to the formal education often enjoyed by wealthy Washington was largely self-taught and honed his intellect through reading and a constant hunger for self-improvement. By the age of 16, he had joined a surveying expedition into the Western Territories, experiences that exposed him to the ruggedness of colonial frontier life and planted the seeds of leadership, resilience, and a sense of the vastness and potential of America. He developed an early fascination with military strategy and honor, and by 1753, at only 21 years old, he was commissioned as a major in the Virginia militia. It was during the French and Indian War that Washington first tasted the realities of battle and leadership. His involvement in the disastrous expedition led by General Edward Braddock, where British troops were ambushed by French and Native American forces, taught Washington the brutal consequences of arrogance and poor planning in warfare. Yet his bravery and composure under fire earned him widespread respect among colonial leaders. After the war, he returned to Virginia as a respected figure, marrying Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow, which elevated his social and financial status considerably. Settling at Mount Vernon, his expansive plantation, Washington was a committed farmer and innovator, deeply involved in agricultural reform and regional politics. But despite his growing personal success, he became increasingly disturbed by British overreach, taxation without representation, and the growing unrest among the colonies. Though he never saw himself as a radical, his sense of duty and belief in liberty pulled him into the revolutionary cause, and by 1775 the Second Continental Congress appointed him commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, a role that would test every ounce of his strength, strategy, patience, and endurance, as he led a ragtag force of farmers and volunteers against the most powerful military empire in the world. When George Washington assumed command of the Continental Army in June 1775, he faced a daunting challenge: how to mold an undisciplined collection of volunteers and poorly equipped farmers into a force capable of standing against the might of the British Empire. What Washington lacked in military training compared to European generals, he made up for in unshakable resolve, humility, and an uncanny ability to lead through example. He understood that victory would not be won through brute strength alone, but by endurance, morale, and unwavering commitment to the cause. His early campaigns were fraught with setbacks. His troops were routed in New York, outmaneuvered in battles, and forced to retreat repeatedly. But Washington refused to let defeat break the spirit of the revolution. Perhaps his most iconic military moment came on the night of December 25, 1776, when he led his frostbitten army across the icy Delaware River to surprise Hessian forces in Trenton, New Jersey. This daring move re-energized the revolutionary effort and showed the world that the Americans, though battered, would not be broken. Throughout the war, Washington faced not only the British, but also internal dissent, mutinies, and scarcity of funds and supplies. He remained calm under pressure, committed to Republican ideals, and refused to become a dictator even when his popularity and influence might have allowed it. His leadership style was grounded in moral authority rather than force. He inspired loyalty by treating his men with respect and sharing in their hardships. At Valley Forge, where troops froze and starved through the winter of 1777 to 1778, it was Washington's presence, daily walks among the tents, and steadfast vision that kept the army from collapse. His decision to bring in Baron von Steuben to professionalize the troops demonstrated his willingness to adapt and delegate when necessary. Washington was not the greatest battlefield tactician of his time, but he understood the greater war of attrition, the importance of perception, and the psychological impact of perseverance. He knew the revolution was not simply about defeating armies, but about surviving long enough for foreign powers like France to see the rebellion as worthy of support. This grand strategy paid off when, in 1781, Washington coordinated with the French Navy and troops to deliver the decisive blow against General Cornwallis at Yorktown, effectively ending the war. Yet, even in victory, Washington remained humble. After the Treaty of Paris was signed, he did something almost unthinkable. He resigned his commission and returned to civilian life, surrendering his military power voluntarily. King George III reportedly said that if Washington truly gave up power, he would be the greatest man in the world. And indeed, Washington's willingness to step away from authority, when others might have clung to it, laid the foundation for a new kind of government, one based not on monarchs or military rule, but on the consent of the governed and the restraint of those in power. Following the American Revolution, George Washington returned to Mount Vernon hoping for a quieter life. However, the fragile new nation was unraveling under the weak Articles of Confederation. Factions quarreled, states competed rather than cooperated, and the threat of economic collapse or foreign interference loomed large. Reluctantly, yet with a deep sense of responsibility, Washington once again answered the call of duty. He presided over the Constitutional Convention in 1787, lending credibility to the effort to forge a stronger federal government. His presence alone helped unify the delegates and assure skeptical citizens that the new framework would not replace one tyranny with another. In 1789, he was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States, still the only person in American history to receive every electoral vote. As president, Washington faced the monumental task of building a functioning government from scratch. There were no precedents, no models, only principles and ideals. Washington carefully established the presidency as a position of honor and service, not royalty. He surrounded himself with brilliant advisors, including Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury and Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. Understanding that diverse opinions and civil discourse were essential to a functioning democracy, even if their disagreements were sharp, Washington created the cabinet, shaped executive authority, and set a standard for future presidents by declining to wield unchecked power. One of his greatest contributions was voluntarily stepping down after 2 terms, setting an informal limit on presidential power that held until the 22nd Amendment made it law more than a century later. His presidency was marked by both domestic challenges and international pressures. At home, he faced the Whiskey Rebellion, a major test of federal authority, and abroad, he skillfully kept the young nation neutral amidst the brewing conflicts between Britain and revolutionary France. Though criticized by partisans, Washington remained committed to unity and stability. In his legendary farewell address, he warned against the dangers of political parties, foreign entanglements, and regional divisions, wisdom that echoes across the centuries. Washington understood that the survival of the Republic required not only good governance, but also virtuous leadership. He was not a perfect man. He struggled with moral contradictions, especially regarding slavery. Still, he evolved in his thinking and made provisions in his will to free his slaves, an extraordinary act for his time. Washington's humility, foresight, and unwavering dedication to the American experiment earned him the enduring title of Father of his country. His legacy lives not in grandiose declarations, but in his example, a leader who understood power, yet never let it master him. He shaped the office of the presidency with a blend of firmness and restraint, dignity and modesty, establishing the executive branch not as a throne, but as a trust. By the time he died in 1799, the world recognized that the United States had not only survived its birth but had begun to flourish. That success was thanks to the steady hand and character of George Washington. Away from battlefields and presidential chambers, George Washington was also a landowner, innovator, and private citizen who cared deeply for his home and the future of the Republic. He helped build Mount Vernon. His sprawling estate overlooking the Potomac River in Virginia was not just a residence, it was a symbol of the balance between public duty and private life. Washington was a meticulous manager of his plantation, overseeing farming operations, experimenting with crop rotation, and exploring sustainable agricultural methods long before they became mainstream. He was also a skilled surveyor and businessman who diversified Mount Vernon beyond tobacco farming, shifting toward grains and establishing a successful distillery. However, Washington's status as a planter was inextricably tied to the system of slavery. Like many of his contemporaries, he inherited enslaved individuals through family and marriage, and for decades he relied on their labor. But as he aged, Washington's conscience grew more troubled by this contradiction to the ideals of liberty and justice he championed. Unlike many of his peers, he took a step that few in his position dared to take. He arranged in his will for the emancipation of the enslaved people he personally owned to be freed upon the death of his wife Martha. It was a symbolic gesture that, while imperfect, demonstrated a rare willingness to confront the moral failings of the time. Washington believed in the power of legacy not just in statues or stories, but in example. He declined titles, refused the allure of kingship, and emphasized civic virtue over personal ambition. His belief in the peaceful transfer of power became a cornerstone of American democracy. Generations after his death, Washington's name would adorn schools, cities, and the very capital of the United States. His image would be enshrined on currency, his birthday honored as a national holiday, and his life studied by scholars across the globe. Yet Washington's true legacy lies not in marble or monument, but in his restraint, his foresight, and his quiet strength. He was a man who could have ruled, but chose instead to serve. A man who was offered crowns, but chose instead a constitution. He lived not for glory, but for posterity, always conscious of how history would remember him not for what he said, but for what he did. In his letters, Washington often spoke of the need for future generations to nurture liberty and unity, for he understood that a nation, like a garden, must be cultivated continuously to bear fruit. His example of integrity, sacrifice, and humility remains a guiding light in times of uncertainty. In a world often captivated by power, George Washington showed that true greatness comes not from dominance, but from character. Through the wars he led, the government he shaped, and the values he upheld, Washington didn't just help create a nation, he gave it its moral compass.